Coming up today on the Nick Craig Show, more lawfare in the judicial system as an executive order from President Donald Trump as it relates to mail-in voting went to the United States Supreme Court. Now another judge is trying to block it. We'll get into all the details coming up. And a good Friday morning to you. Welcome into the Nick Craig Show, streaming live this morning on YouTube, Rumble, X, and Facebook. Don't forget that you can listen to the show 24/7 on demand in your favorite podcast app. It is real simple, totally easy, and free to do. Just search for the Nick Craig Show in your favorite podcast app or visit the website nickcraig.com. Our program brought to you this morning by the Law Group here in Wilmington. For any legal questions or challenges, visit Melissa Gott and her team online at lawgroupnc.com. We'll hear more from them coming up a little bit later on in the program this morning. One of the more consistent trends that we have talked about over the last year and a half, a little more than a year and a half now, that President Donald Trump has been back in the Oval Office operating as the 47th president of the United States, has been the Democrats, and to their credit, very useful ability within the judicial system. This is something that has been growing for years. It's not new. It's not something that has just popped up. But it is a growing trend and something, again, to the credit of the Democrats, that they have been able to do very well, which is use court systems, use friendly judges to essentially govern. Now, it is important to note, that, and none of about what we're going to talk about on the show today is meant to say that the courts don't have a place. That is not what I'm saying by any stretch of the imagination. I am a strong believer in our separate branches of government, and the judiciary absolutely has a very important role to say and to operate in. Let me make that abundantly clear before we kick off this conversation today. With that being said, you are not supposed to use the judiciary to govern. The judiciary is supposed to be there to rule on whether things that are being done politically are allowed, whether those things are constitutional, whether those things are within the authority of whoever a governing body is that is operating. And while Democrats will argue and say, yeah, but that's what we're using it for, that's not the case. Right, we have seen this consistently, not only at the federal level, but we've seen this here in a big time in North Carolina. For example, we talked about on the show earlier this week, the continued battle that Democrats are fighting here in North Carolina, as it or did fight and in some cases remain the fight as it relates to voter ID. This very controversial idea that you have to show some sort of valid identification, which for the vast majority of people is a state-issued driver's license, before you vote. It was in 2018, the 2018 midterm elections, in which more than 2 million North Carolinians said, yes, we want a constitutional amendment. We support a constitutional amendment that requires voter ID. It wasn't until 5 years later, in 2023, that the lawfare stopped and voter ID was implemented. And that is a great example of a situation in which Democrats have hijacked the judicial system. In the case we're talking about the state court system here in North Carolina, to do politics. And frankly, that is not the place for the courts. When you are in the minority, when you are on the losing side of a political issue like the Democrats were as it relates to some of the discussion and some of the conversation with voter ID, when you're on the losing side of that issue, well, then you lose. Plain and simple, right? Well, you can say, oh, well, we don't like the ruling. Oh, we don't like how this played out. But the reality is one that's very simple. You don't have the majorities. And in the case of North Carolina's voter ID laws, you had a situation where 55%, more than 2 million people said, hey, this is something that we agree with. This is something we want. This is something that we are going to show up for in the midterm elections back in November of 2018 and vote for. And in fact, they did. And for 5 years following that, We saw consistent lawsuits, consistent battles filed by those on the political left on a political issue. And that is where my problem exists. And this has been something, again, to the credit of the Democrats, they have been able to weaponize and use very much to their advantage. Taking friendly judiciaries, taking friendly court systems, and using it to essentially govern while they're in the minority. And that is something that I think is just out of control. I mean, the whole point of politics as a overall structure is to win elections, gain majorities, and then govern. Both sides operate under this structure. If you are a Republican, you want Republicans to win, you want them to govern. If you are a Democrat, you want Democrats to win, you want Democrats to govern. There is nothing controversial about this. There is nothing that is beyond the pale about this. This is the game. This is why there is hundreds of millions of dollars poured into elections that take place. This is why the fights get so nasty. This is why the political process, and in many cases, is as ugly and as dirty as it is. The goal is to win. The goal is to win and then, of course, govern once you have a coalition, once you have a majority. And there are some serious problems with that when you say, the legislative branch has its place. And, yes, of course, the legislative branch is allowed to govern, is allowed to write legislation and go through the legislative process. And then you say, but look at this group over here. Look at this judiciary. Look at this legal system. Well, what if we don't win and we just use these guys over there to do our bidding? It's called Sue Till Blue, and it is something that the Democrats have used pretty significantly over the last couple of decades. So let's go back to earlier in the week when the United States Supreme Court ruled on Monday that President Donald Trump's executive order, which tightens the rules around mail-in voting, can be implemented ahead of the November midterm elections. As you can imagine, and as we talked about earlier this week with Governor Josh Stein and the Democrats' continued fights over things like mail-in voting here in North Carolina, that is something that the Democrats don't agree with. They don't like voter ID. They don't like the fact that there is scrutiny being put on the idea of just sending out ballots to anybody and everybody that has ever stepped foot into a state, and therefore that person is a relevant, eligible voter. It was a 6-3 decision out of the nation's high court, no surprise there, with liberal justices Ketanji Brown Jackson, Elaine Kagan, and Sonia Sotomayor in the dissent. The three dissenting opinions from the state's high court. When, by all accounts, this marks a major victory for the Trump administration. This makes and is a major win. Now, to learn more about this executive order, we have to go all the way back to the end of March, beginning of April, when the president signed an executive order tightening the rules around mail-in voting ahead of the midterm elections. This EO is from months ago. We were still in the spring when this was being discussed and this executive order was signed. And the order very clearly laid out a process. It would require a list to be created in each state of citizens who are eligible to vote. Absentee ballots would only be sent to those on those approved lists. Ballots would have secure envelopes with barcodes to track them. That is the horrific implementation that the administration was looking to put forward, right? Because you have problems in states, and we just saw this play out in California not too many months ago with very questionable mail-in ballot results in a state that mails a ballot to everybody. That is why the California election results look the way that they do. It is why in California it takes literally weeks to get the final results, because there are hundreds of thousands, millions, potentially, depending on the race and what's taking place, of outstanding mail-in ballots that are all over the place. With no voter ID requirement, anybody that gets their hand on that ballot can fill it out, dump it in a UPS box, and lo and behold, it makes its way back to some sort of Board of Election office, and the vote is tallied. That's a major problem. And we have seen in years past very questionable things as it relates to large-scale mail-in balloting that takes place across the United States of America. We have seen that. We've seen it with our own two eyes. We saw it in 2020, and there are still a lot of unanswered questions as it relates to some of the procedures and processes that roll out in states across the nation. Those questions still exist, plain and simple. So we are talking about an executive order that President Donald Trump signed back at the end of March, beginning of April of this year. An executive order from him that would tighten some rules as it relates to the Postal Service and mail-in balloting that is very prominent in blue states like California. The executive order signed by the president would create a list in each state of eligible voters. Only those eligible voters would be viable to receive an absentee ballot. Those ballots would require some sort of secure envelope and barcode systems to track them, which is, of course, a very common way to track things and keep track of things is, of course, barcodes. You see these throughout a variety of different forms in your life. So, no surprise, Trump signs the executive order, and what happens? Immediately, there are lawsuits filed against the administration as it relates to this executive order. We then go back to this past Monday, just a couple of days ago, when the Supreme Court ruled in a 6-3 decision that the president's executive order, which tightens some of those rules around mail-in voting, can in fact be implemented ahead of the November election. In its ruling by the Supreme Court on Monday, the court overturned a lower court order that blocked the Trump administration from enforcing the mail-in voting order in response to a lawsuit filed by 23 Democrat-led states who argue that the directive is unconstitutional and infringes on their authority to administer elections. Now, inherently, I agree with some of that criticism because, in fact, elections are not run at the federal level. That is a fact. That is an accurate statement, and I'm glad that they do not. The individual states should, in fact, be responsible for operating elections. But there's one caveat here. The process of using mail-in balloting, in fact, transitions itself into a federal issue. Why? Well, because the states that operate significant mail-in balloting, and let's be honest, every state that offers absentee by mail, what are they using to send ballots out and receive them? The vast majority of time, at least 100% of the time sending those ballots out, they are using the United States Postal Service, USPS, to send out ballots to individuals. Now, most ballots are returned via the Postal Service. You can, in many states, I'm going to speak just here for North Carolina, you can physically return your ballot to a Board of Election office if you vote absentee by mail, so you don't have to use the Postal Service to return it, but I think the vast majority of people do. And so now you've got this situation taking place where elections are run in the states, which makes a lot of sense and I believe should stay that way. In North Carolina, they're administered in all 100 counties. It's a very decentralized system, but there's a lot of leaning on something like the United States Postal Service to actually conduct these elections as it relates to absentee by mail. The Supreme Court did not rule on whether Trump's order was lawful, but determined that it was too early for states to sue over it because the harms must be, quote, concrete rather than conjecture or hypothetical, saying essentially, you put the cart in front of the horse. You filed lawsuits claiming all of this irreparable damage, this irreparable harm as it relates to these executive order restrictions on mail-in balloting, but you don't have any concrete evidence to back this up. It is plain conjecture. It is plain hypothetical situations at this point in time. That is what the six-justice majority said. The majority further noted that federal courts are barred from adjudicating disputes dependent on contingent future events that may not occur as anticipated or indeed may not occur at all. And that is a direct quote from the majority opinion. The injunction lifted by the High Court had applied to 23 states challenging the president's order. Democratic New York Attorney General Letitia James, who was part of the lawsuit, vowed that, quote, the fight is far from over. She said in a statement, the decision is a, quote, painful setback, but will not be the final word. The right to vote is sacred, and no administration should be allowed to put the right in jeopardy by making it harder for eligible voters to cast their ballots. Because, of course, as we talked about earlier this week, Democrats believe that you're incompetent. Democrats believe that you are stupid, and Democrats believe that you can't follow a process. Now, it is important to note that the majority of what is in this executive order that was enacted by the administration back in late March, early April of this year is all procedural stuff behind the scenes, like these barcodes, like using these secure envelopes. It does not make it harder to vote because there is a barcode on your ballot. I mean, anybody that would argue that point is a fool. There's nothing that is, there's nothing in there that makes this a higher bar to entry because there is a, well, no pun intended, but a literal barcode on a ballot or on an envelope or on some sort of ballot container inside of an envelope. That is an absurd thing to make, an absurd claim to make. James continued by saying the fight is far from over. We're exploring our legal options. Similarly, Pennsylvania Governor Josh Shapiro pledged to say we will see the Trump administration in court. The Democrat governor wrote, not so fast. Today's SCOTUS decision does not deal with the substance of Trump's unconstitutional executive order and does not mean that his illegal attempt to restrict mail-in voting will go forward. Donald Trump does not run elections here in Pennsylvania or any other state. Senate Minority Leader Chuck Schumer, the Democrat from New York, called the ruling a, quote, disgrace and likened it to thrusting a dagger into the heart of our democracy. A direct quote there from Schumer. He went on to say, Trump's effort to turn the Postal Service into a voter suppression machine is blatantly unconstitutional. Yet his MAGA Supreme Court is refusing to stop it from going forward. Trump's malicious effort to stop mail-in voting is nothing but election interference in broad daylight, driving a dagger into the heart of our democracy. Boy, you know, that would mean something to me. Just taking a quick aside. That would mean something to me if Democrats hadn't been using this same, rolling out this same trick and pony show for like a decade, for more than a decade now. I might put some stock into somebody like Chuck Schumer, who is a very influential member in United States politics. I might put some stock into his statement about destroying democracy, or in this case, driving a dagger into the heart of our democracy, if this wasn't the same boy who's cried wolf story over and over again. I mean, how many times has Donald Trump destroyed the quote unquote democracy that we live in? It's, of course, a democratic republic, not a true democracy. But how many times can one person destroy democracy and us not feel the results? I mean, I think that's a fair question to ask, no? You're going to claim, you're going to argue that the president of the United States is destroying the fabric of the very nation of which he is the elected president of. Yeah, at what point am I going to feel the impacts of that? Because that's a pretty serious thing to say, right? If I said to you, hey, I'm destroying a company and the company continues to operate and there's no significant changes and everything seems to be operating for the most part pretty well, either A, I am not good at destroying said company, or B, I wasn't actually destroying the company at all. Right? Because that's a pretty serious thing to say, like driving a dagger into the heart of our democracy, or destroying our democracy, or ripping our democracy apart. But have no fear. Even with the Supreme Court's order this week, more lawfare took place. We'll get into those details coming up here in just a couple of minutes. But before that, I want to tell you about the law group here in Wilmington and remind you that when legal challenges arise, make sure you put your trust in Melissa Gott and the law group right here in Wilmington. Since 2003, their experienced attorneys have provided high-quality, affordable legal services across eastern North Carolina. Whether you're facing a divorce, navigating a real estate transaction, or maybe you're in a position where you need a strong defense, no matter the issue, the Law Group has your back. Their dedicated team ensures your questions are answered and issues are resolved as quickly as possible. Great news, folks. They're located in downtown Wilmington and just a phone call away at 910-251-6088, or you can visit them online at lawgroupnc.com. That's 910-251-6088, or online, lawgroupnc.com. It's the Law Group. Experience and dedication you can rely on. We appreciate Melissa Gott, her team, and their continued support here of the Nick Craig Show. So, very interesting situations taking place as it relates to the judiciary and another one of these executive orders from the Trump administration. That's not the end of the story. Have no fear. We'll have more detail on this coming up in just a couple of minutes as the Nick Craig Show continues on this Friday morning, streaming live, YouTube, Rumble, X, Facebook, and available 24/7 wherever you get your podcasts. And a good Friday to you. Welcome back to the Nick Craig Show. Coming up on Monday evening, we will be hosting our monthly hangout for those that support the show over at patreon.com/Nick Craig. We get together once a month to chat about all of the news, topics, and issues of the day. That is exclusive to those that support the show over at patreon.com/Nick Craig. You get access to our daily show notes and our monthly hangout. That's heading your way Monday night, 7 p.m. Look forward to chatting with everybody. Patreon.com/Nick Craig. You can also get that link over on the website, nickcraig.com. All right, we are talking about a couple of different things as it relates to executive orders and what I'll call essentially politicking, for lack of a better term, within the judiciary. And as I've stated and mentioned at the open of the show, to the Democrats' credit, they have been very good at using, and I would argue weaponizing, the judicial system to enact governance, because they are in the minority, which is an accurate statement right now. You look up at Washington, D.C., you've got a Republican in the Oval Office and President Donald Trump, and you've got Republican majorities in the United States House and United States Senate. And we see that play out. We've seen that play out for those that are here in North Carolina since 2011, since the Republicans took control of the North Carolina General Assembly. A lot of the things that they have finally been able to implement is after years of Democrats using the judicial system to enact policy. We saw one of the greatest examples of this is voter ID, which voters here in North Carolina, 55% of them, more than 2 million individuals, said yes in 2018 when there was a question asked on the ballot, do you want a constitutional amendment to require voter identification, photo ID, in the state of North Carolina? It was overwhelmingly approved by citizens across the state, and for 5 years, it was struck down in North Carolina courts. It wasn't until a 2023 decision from the North Carolina Supreme Court that voter ID was finally implemented. We, of course, have seen it play out since that period of time. We've had multiple elections since 2023, and lo and behold, what has happened? Nothing. Everything has worked fine. People have shown their driver's licenses, their state-issued ID cards, their freely available voter ID card provided by all 100 county board of elections to individuals at zero cost in the state of North Carolina. But it was 5 years of very expensive litigation, back and forth nonsense as it relates to things that people, and it's so funny, right? Before the break, I mentioned the commentary from Senate Minority Leader Chuck Schumer on the Supreme Court's ruling on Trump's executive order from March as it relates to mail-in balloting using the United States postal system, when he says that this is a dagger in the heart of our democracy, so on and so forth. Isn't it pretty rich that we talk about the threat of destroying of democracy? In this case, the blatantly unconstitutional actions of the president, election interference. Democrats always use this stuff, yet when they block the will of the people like they did here in North Carolina as it relates to voter ID, there's no issue. These arguments aren't made by them at that point. When they are using the court system to usurp the voters of a state like North Carolina, the so-called democracy that they care so much about, they always are yelling and screaming about the fabric of our democracy, this and the democracy that. And it's just a useless talking point at this period of time. But they use these phrases. And then when they say, hey, voters, you did the wrong thing. Hey, voters, you voted the wrong way on voter ID here in North Carolina. You didn't make the right decision. We're going to take it to the courts and we'll allow them to give us what we want. It's totally absurd. So just highlighting again what this calls for. Trump's executive order calls for the creation of lists of eligible voters and directed the United States Postal Service to deliver ballots to only people that are on those lists. The order also called for the Department of Homeland Security working in conjunction with the Social Security Administration to create and maintain those lists. Meanwhile, the Department of Justice, the DOJ, is tasked with investigating any wrongdoing in mail-in ballot distribution. States that disobey the order would risk the loss of federal funds. No surprise there. If you are ignoring the directives, well, then you lose out on federal dollars. So the Supreme Court, 6-3 on Monday, didn't rule necessarily, well, not even necessarily. They didn't rule on whether the order was lawful or not. They ruled it's too early in the process to claim irreparable damage and irreparable harm from this decision. That was on Monday. We then go to yesterday, where another federal judge has blocked the United States Postal Service from implementing core new parts of its rule that was adopted at the president's direction from that March the 31st executive order. U.S. District Judge Idara Tawani in Boston issued a temporary restraining order based on the executive order. And according to the New York Post, they say it opens a new tab at the behest of a Democrat-led state and voting rights groups after the United States Supreme Court on Monday issued a ruling that led to the lifting of an earlier injunction blocking Trump's plans as it relates to mail-in voting. The Supreme Court on Monday, again, did not say that this executive order was totally lawful and totally above board. We haven't even gotten to that point. The Democrats were so quick to start their legal process after this executive order was announced. They were so quick to argue that this is unconstitutional and there's going to be all of this damage that takes place across the nation, so on and so forth. So quick to do this that the court systems have not even had an ability to rule on whether this order is lawful or not. And let me be clear. I know that the legal system is slow. I know that not everything happens immediately. I know that unfortunately the what I like to call the slow cog, the slow wheels of justice plays out. I get all of that. But we are months since this executive order, and we're at a period of time right now where nothing has actually been implemented. Nothing has actually taken place, and courts have not even had the ability to determine whether this is lawful or not. The decision led to a frantic effort by dozens of Democratic state attorney generals and voting rights groups, including the League of Women Voters, to renew their legal fight and secure an order that would prevent the United States Postal Service from enforcing a rule that was allowed to take effect on Wednesday. Supreme Court said on Monday, yep, we can move forward with this, at least for right now. We're removing this temporary injunction. Things could begin being implemented on Wednesday. And lo and behold, Thursday, what happens? A Democrat federal judge from the Boston area in Massachusetts said, I know best. We're going to move forward. In Thursday's ruling, the United States District Judge said that the rule risks preventing citizens from casting ballots by mail unless states secure the Postal Service's sign-off on envelopes used for that purpose and upload information on each voter into an electronic portal run by the agency. The judge said that the agency, referring to the Postal Service, had presented no evidence regarding fraudulent mail-in voting that would necessitate such a rule, which she said was likely unlawful and adopted in violation of the United States Constitution, which gives states the authority to administer elections. Hold on here. The Postal Service has to bring evidence to a judge to justify an executive order? That's not how governance works at all. The president is allowed to sign executive orders on anything that he wants. And the judge's argument here is, well, the Postal Service hasn't brought forth evidence regarding fraudulent mail-in voting. There's plenty of pieces of evidence, but what kind of justification is that? So let me make sure I understand this. If the Postal Service had brought forth evidence, of which there is plenty, especially out in a state like California, of individuals fraudulently voting, she wouldn't have put this injunction in that she did on Thursday? Is that what I'm supposed to believe? Because I don't believe that for 1 second. This is a good excuse for this federal district court judge to block the president's executive order. No amount of evidence would have changed the outcome from this judge. Doesn't matter how much evidence was brought forward, we would be talking about and be having this exact same discussion right now. She just wouldn't have included that in her very important decision as to why she was going to block the administration, right? Don't be fooled by this at all. The result of this would have been exactly the same. We are talking about an executive order signed by President Donald Trump back in the month of March. Ongoing legal battles as it relates to mail-in voting, as the president's executive order back in March would have required that the United States Postal Service go through a process to make sure that mail-in ballots delivered in states across the nation were delivered to actual people that were eligible to vote. You know, the discussion is, well, elections are run by states. This was in the ruling from a district court judge out of Boston on Thursday, who said that this executive order violates the United States Constitution, which gives states the authority to administer elections, which I agree with. The federal government should not administer elections. But at the exact same time, you have got these states that are using the United States Postal Service to conduct large portions of their elections. What is the number out in California? It's something like 65% of voters, of people that vote in elections, are doing so via mail. You're talking about more than half, significantly more than half of all the votes that are coming in a state like California are traversing the federal United States Postal Service. And so my argument would be, if states don't want the federal government to have anything to do with elections, which again, I agree with, then they need to find another way to transmit these ballots. You can't use the federal postal service and then go, well, you don't have any authority to say anything. There's a problem here, because it's taking a state thing, which it should be as it relates to voting, and you are using federal resources. You are using the federal government to conduct large portions of those elections. So the judge here, U.S. District Judge Indrana Tawani, blocked this order that the Supreme Court said could move forward on Monday. She wrote in her opinion, USPS's interests in correcting an unsubstantiated problem through likely unconstitutional means is defrauded by the overwhelming risk of pervasive disenfranchisement of citizens who need access to mail-in ballots in order to vote. There you go. That's the same thing over and over again. Voters are being disenfranchised by this. Voters and citizens who need access to mail ballots in order to vote. And there are, in fact, people that need access to mail-in ballots. No issue with that at all. I don't have a problem inherently with absentee by mail, which is what it's called here in North Carolina. I do have a problem, however, when states like California mail out ballots to anybody that has walked into the state, it has ever stepped foot in California, is put on the voter rolls. And the videos were all over social media earlier this year with the LA mayor race and the California governor race. I saw a video from that somebody had posted on, it was either TikTok or Instagram, of a young woman who lived at an apartment complex, went to go get her mail, opened her mailbox, and there was like 8 or 9 ballots sitting in her mailbox, addressed to her address, of people that I guess had previously lived there, which is, of course, a relatively common thing at an apartment complex. Most people don't live there forever. But in the state of California, who does nothing to clean up their voter rolls, this woman opens up her mailbox and there's 8 or 9 ballots in there, of which she could have voted on every single one of them, thrown a stamp on it, dumped it back into a post office box, and all of those ballots would have counted. That's the process in California, using the federal United States Postal Service. I think there's a problem with that. I believe that there's an issue there. The restraining order issued by the judge on Thursday will remain in place for 14 days while she considers whether to issue a long-term preliminary injunction to block the rule, which she absolutely will. The judge, who is an appointee of Democratic President Barack Obama, plans to consider whether to do so during a September the 3rd hearing. She, one of the lawyers for the American Civil Liberties Union, the ACLU, wrote, quote, "Today's order presses pause on an unlawful power grab that would sow chaos and confusion for millions of voters who depend on mail-in ballots. Because you're stupid, you're an idiot, you can't figure out how to follow a process as it relates to voting. So here's your friendly neighbor, the ACLU, the American Civil Liberties Union, backing you up and making sure that you have the right to vote. And if, God forbid, an administration or frankly just Republicans anywhere across the nation do anything as it relates to voting, that is a overreach of government. It is unconstitutional. It is a power grab. It is destroying our democracy, so on and so forth. You know, all the usual talking points. The United States Postal Service issued the rule to implement an executive order that the president signed in March after years of President Trump and Republicans calling for tighter rules on mail-in voting and questions about mail-in voting, which in large part started after the 2020 election. Under the rule, states must supply the United States Postal Service with lists of mail-in ballot recipients, and all outbound and return ballot envelopes must bear unique barcodes. The United States Postal Service, under the rule, may refuse to deliver ballots that do not comply with the new standards or are associated with voters who do not appear on the lists. All 50 states allow some form of mail-in voting, with 29 allowing voters to ask to cast a ballot that way without providing a reason, and 8 conducting their elections entirely by mail. By the way, North Carolina is one of the 29 states that allows anybody to request an absentee ballot. During the 2024 election, the United States Postal Service says it processed nearly 100 million ballots and about 30% of votes nationwide during the 2024 election cycle. This is not a small group of individuals. This is not a very small group of people that are voting, essentially using the United States Postal Service. More than 100 million ballots. 30% of all voters nationwide cast ballots by mail, according to details from the United States Postal Service. They argue that the new federal restriction risks disenfranchising voters and would unduly burden states in the weeks running up to an election, forcing them to buy new envelopes and equipment, establish new systems, and train staff. This is the part that really sticks with me. Now these left-wing states are calling foul because it's too close to the election. The president issued this executive order back on March the 31st. So you had, based on a calendar, you had all of May, June, and July to get this stuff figured out. 3 full months from this March the 31st, and obviously a couple of weeks after that immediately. You had 3 or 4 months to figure this whole thing out. States all across the nation could have been working on implementation of this stuff for months, 3 or 4 months now. But because the ACLU, because these state attorney generals and these state governors in blue places across the nation decided to immediately take the administration to court, claiming irreparable damage and harm to voters and so on and so forth, because they did that, they have once again logjammed the process. They have once again completely taken something and grinded it to a halt, as they have done with many of the president's executive orders. And now they're going to cry foul and claim, we just don't have enough time. This is just too close to the cycle. Yeah, it is pretty close to the cycle. But to me, you can't cry foul on that when you are the party that caused this delay to take place. From my vantage point, you lose the argument to claim that this is too close to an election cycle when, frankly, you are the reason why this is happening so close. It had these Democrat attorney generals and the ACLU and these other left-wing groups not sued the Trump administration immediately after this executive order, we wouldn't be discussing this right now. But because they chose to do that, we are now dealing with the repercussions of their actions. Plain and simple. So we'll be keeping an eye on this as it relates to mail-in balloting through the Postal Service and its potential impacts on the 2026 midterm elections. We'll keep you up to date with details right here on the Nick Craig Show. All right, that is going to do it for another busy week here across the program. Quick programming note. Next Friday, I will not be here. I will be traveling to Raleigh to be on an episode of PBS's State Lines program throughout the Labor Day weekend. So no Nick Craig Show next Friday, but everything should be normal, barring any crazy technical issues or anything like that coming up next week. So normal beginning half of the week, no show next Friday. And of course, our monthly Patreon hangout headed your way coming up on Monday. Check your email and your Patreon account for that. All right, that's going to do it for a Friday edition. Thanks to the Law Group here in Wilmington. LawGroupNC.com is their website. The Nick Craig Show streams live weekday mornings, 7 a.m., YouTube, Rumble, X, Facebook, available 24/7 in your favorite podcast app, and heard weeknights, 9 to 10 p.m. on WBT Radio in Charlotte. Thanks for spending another week here. Enjoy your weekend. We'll do it again Monday morning, right here on The Nick Craig Show.